What was the one thing that tested a woman's boundaries the most? I paused for a moment thinking. Number. The years had settled on me gently. I had long since learned that it wasn't about age but how you lived. Relationships. No, not that either. I had been married to Ree for 10 years. We were in sync, no problems, at least no big ones. But some things you couldn't quite name, things you refused to acknowledge, still lingered. And for a while now, something nameless had been stirring inside me. Tate, Ree's son from his first marriage, from the very beginning, the word step had always felt too sharp, too distant. I hadn't raised him, but he had been in my life for years, and now he was 23, successful, charismatic, handsome, yet still reserved, introverted, always holding back. And that distance, that invisible wall between us, was what unsettled me the most. That one step he always kept between us, like he was waiting. But for what? He didn't even know. And that was what made it dangerous. That was why I had always made sure we were never alone for too long. If Ree was with us, everything stayed in balance. The lines were clear, everything was safe. The Chicago business trip had been planned perfectly. Ree was supposed to come as always. But this morning, as we sat around the breakfast table, he paused mid-sentence while talking about his project. I won't make it. You two go ahead without me. 1 second. What? He had to be joking. But no, he took a sip of his coffee. His decision already made. Tate's eyes traced the lines on his plate. I don't have to go either, Dad. Ree shook his head. No, it's important that you go with C. You need the experience. Being around her will teach you a lot. As I listened to how innocently Ree spoke, I was feeling something entirely different. A small knot tightened in my stomach. For a brief moment, my eyes flickered to Tate. He was already looking at me, and in that moment, those eyes. It only lasted a few seconds, but in those few seconds, what I felt was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. We were going to be very alone. Ree stood up, resting a hand on my shoulder as he smiled. Take care of him, he said playfully, like I was the one who didn't need protecting. But there was something Ree didn't know. Maybe the one who needed protecting was me. Some plans looked perfect on paper. This Chicago trip had started as one of them. Turning one of my business meetings into a small family getaway seemed like a great idea. It would be a good opportunity for Tate too, getting a closer look at the corporate world, making connections, maybe even opening doors for his future. But now things were shifting. Ree's last-minute change of plans meant Tate and I would be alone together, and that thought created a restless energy inside me that I couldn't control. Later that evening, Tate and I were alone. We were going over plans for the Chicago trip, but somewhere along the way, the conversation started to shift. I was giving him advice about the kind of people he would meet, how he should navigate his path in the business world. But the more we talked, the more I felt it. Something was different, and I wasn't sure if it was just him or if it was me too. But his eyes were on me, not just listening, watching. And every time our gazes met, that familiar weight settled in my stomach. Was it Ree who was supposed to draw the lines? This time I had to be the one to do it. But deep down I knew I couldn't. What if things got out of control just because Ree wasn't around? I needed to push the thought away. This is the first time you're hearing confessions like this. Support us by joining the channel, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Before we continue, you're going to wish this story never ends. The morning of our flight, the sky was overcast. At the airport we sat side by side. Tate was fidgeting with his knees, rubbing his hands together, silent, withdrawn. But this time, it wasn't the usual silence. Even if we weren't saying it out loud, something between us had already begun to take shape. On the plane we settled into our seats. He had the window, I was next to him. At first it was just small talk, business projects, the weather in Chicago. But then his voice dropped into something softer. Honestly, it's probably a good thing my dad didn't come. I turned to him. His eyes met mine just for a second. Why? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. Tate shrugged, a slow knowing smile pulling at his lips. Because you're different when he's around, like you're avoiding something. My breath faltered. What did he mean? Was I? But the scarier part wasn't the question itself. It was the fact that Tate had noticed. By the time we arrived in Chicago, the sun had already set. At the lobby, we checked the reservation my company had arranged. The receptionist smiled as she handed over 2 key cards. "Your family suite is ready, Miss C." I frowned. "Family suite?" The woman nodded. "Yes, a spacious suite with 2 beds. As far as I know, no extra room was booked." "1 second. What?" I had assumed the company had booked 2 separate rooms for us, but now we were sharing the same suite. Tate stepped closer beside me. "It's fine," he said, his voice so calm, so composed. But it tied a knot deep in my stomach. Was it really fine? When we entered the suite, everything felt too luxurious. The floor-to-ceiling windows spread Chicago's city lights across the room, casting a quiet yet charged atmosphere. There were 2 beds, but somehow something still felt off. Tate shrugged off his jacket and draped it over a chair. I stood by the window, staring at the skyline. "Are you tired?" he asked from behind me. I closed my eyes for a second. Why did such a simple question make my chest feel tight? I turned to look at him. His eyes were soft, too deep, too dangerous. "A little," Tate said, stretching his wrists. "I know this is a work trip, but we can take some time to enjoy ourselves too, right?" He smirked, and in that moment, I knew everything I had felt before coming here was right. Some things lost their boundaries when Ree wasn't around, and this time there was no one to keep those boundaries in place. Tate quickly recovered, leaning back with a small grin. "I meant the hotel bar. I need to unwind a little." I let out a breath. The tension in me was unnecessary, something I had created myself. Maybe he was right. It wouldn't hurt to relax a little. Smiled. "Yeah, let's have some fun." The hotel bar was surprisingly stylish. Dim lighting, soft jazz playing in the background, a luxurious atmosphere that blended perfectly into the Chicago night. A few drinks in, I started to feel the weight lift off my shoulders. We talked, we laughed, and I realized I hadn't felt this free in a long time. Tate looked the same, relaxed, lighter. The drinks slowly stripped away his usual shyness. His eyes lingered on me longer. Our conversations felt deeper, charged with something I couldn't name. I tried to stay cautious, but something inside me trembled. Had I never found him attractive before? Or had I always known and just refused to admit it? It was late, my drink was empty. Tate leaned back, his eyes fixed on me, studying me. He bit his lip just slightly. This was the wrong moment. I couldn't stay here any longer. I set my glass down on the bar and slowly stood up. "I'm heading upstairs. I have a meeting in the morning. You shouldn't stay up too late either." Tate nodded slightly, a small smile playing on his lips. "All right, see, good night." But his eyes looked like they were expecting me to say something else. When I got to the room, I still felt unsettled, but it wasn't a bad kind of unease. It was more like a fear of losing control. I dropped my bag in the corner. As I turned toward the bathroom to change, I noticed it. The jacuzzi. All these thoughts, the mess in my head. Maybe some hot water would help. Tate hadn't come upstairs yet, which meant I had a little time to myself. As I sank into the warm water, I thought about what had just happened. The conversation, the closeness, and the way my body had reacted to him. I took a deep breath. Was this normal, or was it just the alcohol? But I couldn't lie to myself. This feeling hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. Tonight, for the first time, I had just let myself feel it. After stepping out of the jacuzzi, I slipped on a robe and walked toward my bed. But something stopped me. He was sprawled across his bed, slightly drunk, fast asleep. His shirt was unbuttoned, his pants slightly undone. A warmth spread through me. He looked so damn good, and seeing him like this, so unguarded, so exposed, it completely wrecked me. I held my breath, quickly turning away to change. Even that wasn't easy. I could hear his breathing, steady, deep, comforting. At one point I lifted my head, and my eyes landed on him again, and I realized just how insanely attractive he was. How much longer could I keep denying this? But there was one thing I knew for sure. I was standing on a very dangerous line. Tate, you should change. His voice was a little hoarse as he blinked awake. His gaze landed on me, then he smiled. He shouldn't have, but he did. And when his broad, defined chest was on full display in front of me, I knew I was looking too long, but I didn't look away. Tate, still smiling, let his eyes lock onto mine. And in that moment, I knew tonight was just the beginning. The next morning we both dressed in sharp, elegant outfits. The room still carried the weight of the tension from last night, but we both acted as if nothing had happened. As Chicago's golden morning light spilled through the windows, I watched Tate button up his shirt. He was so composed, so confident, so mature, so handsome, so dangerous. I held my breath and grabbed my bag. "Shall we go?" Yes. Tate swung his jacket over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto mine. "I'm ready." And I was ready too, but I wasn't sure what I was ready for yet. By the time we left the meeting, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had wanted to observe Tate, to see how he adapted to this kind of environment. But he didn't need to do much. Just by the way he carried himself, he made people trust him. "How was it for you?" asked. Tate tilted his head slightly. "I mostly just watched and listened, but it was definitely useful." Smiled. "You didn't say a word today. You just stood beside me like my assistant. But one day, when you go into your own meetings, if you don't let your shyness get in the way, there's nothing you can't handle." I turned toward him and added, "I'm telling you this as a 48-year-old woman who's been through hundreds of meetings. You can trust me." Tate looked at me for a second, then nodded. "I do trust you." His voice was so genuine that for a moment, I didn't know what to say to break the tension. I gave his shoulder a light tap. "Come on, let's grab a coffee." We sat at a small cafe near the hotel. Tate stirred his coffee, looking deep in thought. "So what about your personal life?" asked casually. He lifted his gaze. "What do you mean?" Shrugged. "How are things with women?" He glanced at me, then smirked slightly. To be honest, there's not much to tell. I didn't believe him. At the bar on the street, even now, women were staring at him. It was like he wasn't even aware of it. But Tate was always the center of attention, and for some reason that realization bothered me, which was ridiculous. It was wrong, and yet I couldn't hide the sharp way I set my coffee cup down on the table. "Let's go back to the hotel." Tate looked a little surprised but didn't question it. We got up and started walking back. My frustration hadn't faded as we climbed the hotel stairs. I didn't even dare to examine why I felt this way, and maybe that's why I didn't notice my footing. Right before stepping into the elevator, my heel slipped. A sharp pain shot through my ankle. Ah! I lost my balance instantly, but before I could fall, Tate's hands caught me. His arm wrapped around my waist, steadying me. "Are you okay?" His voice was laced with concern. I looked up at him. His eyes were right there. And when he looked at me, something inside me ignited. I swallowed. I think I twisted it. We needed to get to the room. Tate didn't hesitate. He slid his arm around my back to support me. As the elevator doors closed, the space suddenly felt too tight. My ankle pulsed with pain, but the only thing I could focus on was Tate's arm around my waist. I was leaning into him, gripping onto his shoulder for balance. But this touch, it didn't feel like an obligation. It felt natural. When the elevator reached our floor, I tried to walk, but I barely took 2 steps before another wave of pain hit me. I started to stumble. Tate immediately noticed. Without hesitation, he lifted me into his arms. "Are you seriously carrying me?" said wide-eyed. He smirked. "You're not really giving me a choice here." His voice held that familiar teasing tone, the one that made my stomach flip. He adjusted his grip, securing me against his chest. And as I rested against him, I felt him. The warmth of his body, the strength in his hold, his breath near my skin. And I knew we weren't supposed to be this close. I couldn't stop it. When we reached the room, he carefully laid me down on the bed. He adjusted my legs, but the hem of my skirt had ridden up slightly, folding awkwardly. I should have fixed it, but I didn't because my eyes were on Tate, because his eyes were on me. A moment too long, then Tate exhaled softly, shook his head and pulled back. "I'll get some ice." He turned toward the mini fridge while I stayed there, thinking about things I shouldn't be thinking about, feeling things I shouldn't be feeling. When he came back holding the ice pack, his face was serious. He knelt in front of me, carefully taking my ankle in his hands. When he pressed the cold pack against my skin, I sucked in a sharp breath. "I should have told you before." I lifted my gaze. "Told me what?" He looked at me deep, intense. "You can't run from this, see?" He swallowed. "We can't." Something hot spread through my veins. This was dangerous, but at the same time it felt too right. "Tate." But before I could finish my sentence, his hand lifted to my face. His thumb brushed softly along the corner of my lips, and in that moment there was no going back. He pulled me in. I pulled him in, and finally he kissed me. It was soft, but the energy behind it was undeniable. Slow yet electric, like a force pulling me under, consuming me completely. And for the first time I didn't even think about stopping it. I should have, but I didn't. It was clear that we didn't want to waste any time. It was like we had been waiting for this moment for a long time. We hadn't even touched the clothes. I'd almost forgotten the pain in my leg. Tate came up to me, and he was really close. I could see what his hands were trying to do. We were moving forward. We didn't want to wait too long. When I said, "Tate, you're very handsome, and I have to admit that I'm very attracted to you," I was so excited that my body couldn't stand still. Tate told me I was beautiful. That moment I felt something big inside me. I may have made a loud noise. I don't remember. Can guess why. I looked at Tate, and his shirt was unbuttoned. "It's very impressive what a big body you have." He was very big in his whole body, and it excited me a lot. I had to help him sometimes because of that. "I hope the hotel is well insulated," Tate said. I laughed. "You're going to need a lot of hotels with good insulation from now on." And I was shocked. My body contracted. My legs were exerting a lot of force. I think Tate liked that because he had the same reaction. This was just the beginning. What about after this? Tate, breathless and grinning, looked at me. "Did you really just say that, see?" My vision was still blurry, my breathing unsteady. "I did," I whispered. And in that moment, as I saw the hunger in his eyes, I knew there was no turning back. As he leaned back slightly, his breath warm against my skin, I felt every inch of my body react. Tate, still holding my gaze, smirked. "I guess this Chicago business trip is going to last a little longer." I froze for a second, then I started laughing. "Looks like it," I said, trying to steady my breath. Tate tilted his head slightly, that same knowing smirk still on his lips. "I have no complaints about that, see?" We didn't look away from each other. We just kept smiling. This was only the beginning, and nothing would ever be the same again. This story isn't over. Stay tuned for more. If you've made it this far, I know this story has gotten to you. There's so much more to come, and you won't want to miss any of it. Hit that follow button, turn on notifications, and don't forget to leave a comment below.